Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and here we are back again for the 30 whatever time with my. We have to be good friends by now, don't we?
Have to be by now.
By the way,
yeah.
This is my great good friend Chris Shelton.
Hey everybody! So welcome to my show as well. This is our collective intro for our shows. So this is the Sensibly Speaking podcast as well. Thank you very much for showing up and inviting us into your home this week. This week, we are going to be talking about Charles Manson and the Process Church and things connected with this stuff. Now, I'm going to lead by saying, admitting, I know very little about this topic. And the reason I'm going to say that is because I actually know all kinds of things, but I know that there is so much controversy and so many facts in dispute or alternative facts offered about the timeline, the chronology, and the intention and motivation of Charles Manson and his connection with the Church of Scientology, his connection with another group called the Process Church, their connections with Satanism and murder and Son of Sam and all kinds of dots that have been connected about these things that I know that I don't know. And I know that that's a better place to be than thinking I do. And that's why I'm heading off this podcast saying that is, look, I know some things. I'll be able to contribute to this conversation, obviously, but I'm going to fall back to and rely on Jon, who has done much more recent and deeper study of Charles Manson, of his connections with Scientology, his practice with it, and how that informed or did it inform his behavior. So that all being said, right, let's go ahead and get into this, Jon.
Let's get into this.
Yeah.
Okay, so sometime back in the last century, in the 1980s, remember the 1980s, Chris?
Oh, so do I remember it so well.
And lots and lots of documents flowed through my hands during that time because I was sort of elected as the unofficial historian of Scientology. People just went, oh, send it to Jon. I've got 60 bankers' boxes full of material. When Gordon Melton was telling me that he was, when he retired, going to write another book about Scientology, having written a crapulous mess about it before. But, you know, he was going to write another book about it. But unfortunately, Janet Reitman hadn't returned his box of materials to him. And I said, Gordon, I'll give you 60 boxes if you write the book. But he didn't. So he's writing about vampires now, which is much more interesting and true than his other work, frankly. Sorry about that.
Oh no, I'll agree. Vampires are my go-to horror fantasy creature. So I'll actually support Melton in that effort.
Excellent. That's good. Just keep them away from anything that's to do with the so-called new religious
exactly.
movement. Exactly. You know, it's not just Scientology that he made a mess of. The Church of I Am, his book about that is awful. But anyway, I digress, and that's what I'm famous for, I suppose, meandering. So what happened was that among the documents, you know, the masses of documents, say 60 boxes, there was a red box that had been taken by the FBI in the raid in 1977 on the Los Angeles premises of Scientology. And the red boxes were kept by Branch 1, the Investigation, Information, Harassment Department, the covert data collection. I mean, we have overt data collection, and then we have the stuff we steal, and that was their job. And there's an order that basically says that any sensitive material is kept in a red box and must be destroyed. Once you hear they're at the door coming in with a search warrant, you destroy the red boxes. And they panicked. one of the red boxes was on Charles Manson. Now, when I mentioned in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky in 1990, when I mentioned that Charles Manson had had 150 hours of auditing, I thought this was common knowledge because I've got their documents. And the principal document is a report written to Mary Sue Hubbard, who was the controller of the Guardian's office. And it was written a month before the Manson trial began, right? The trial began in July 1970. Okay. A month before, Scientology is already, they've done a full investigation because they fear that people will realize that Manson had done Scientology, and they quite rightly realize that that might not be good public relations. The amazing thing is they've kept the lid on this story for decades. When I mentioned it, as I said, I thought it was just, people will know this. And what happened was I was talking with my friend Eric Hunley on a show. And after we'd finished, he said, "Oh, your friend Jolly West was running the Manson family." I'm like, what? You suddenly entered history. You're suddenly being told that somebody you knew and liked was actually evil. Yeah. In the extreme. So he said, yeah, he'd interviewed this guy, Tom O'Neill, who'd had a best-selling book called Chaos, which took him 20 years to research. And it destroys the original popular story of Manson, which is Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter. Bugliosi was the prosecutor. And as O'Neill, I'm not going to knock O'Neill for his investigation. His investigation is good. He found out a lot of interesting things. I am going to knock him for his speculation. Okay. Because what he's saying about Jolly West is absolute speculation. As he says in the book, all he has managed to prove is that Charles Manson and Louis Jolyon West walked the same corridors. They were both, at one time or another, in the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic in the spring of 1967. That's it, spring and summer of 67. He doesn't prove they ever met. And he from there sets Jolly up as the man who wrote, he says in an interview, the blueprint for MK Ultra. The vicious, awful CIA projects to develop mind control. There were
If I could just interrupt for just a second, just to, because I can only hold this stuff in for so long.
We all have to go at some time.
Well, Chris. We have to, and this is an area where I really don't tread lightly. I am quite incensed very easily by connecting dots that don't connect, because it happens all the time in the conspiracy world. And it's a method of thinking that I used to engage in professionally as a Sea Org member, right? As somebody, and I mean professionally in that I was literally paid for it. I would go around and recruit people into the Sea Org using this kind of reasoning, this kind of logic. Oh, they were in the same place at the same time, therefore... All right, here's a fact, and here's a fact. He was in this building. He was in this building. Now, from that little kernel, I'm going to explode an entire Thanksgiving feast of awful to you about how this man was the architect of MK Ultra. I mean, you are going from a grain of on a sand on the beach to the moon in 2.3 microseconds. It's insane to be able to go there from the factoids that this man has put together. And I got to put that out at the get-go so that people get like how off the rails this kind of thinking is. It's not scientific or intellectual reasoning or thinking, because in academia and science, you have to create a trail of evidence. You don't start at the beginning and then jump to the conclusion. And that's the kind of thinking I see here by O'Neill, and it makes me angry because I feel it's irresponsible. That being said, please continue on.
absolutely, I agree with you that, and we have to be so careful in the, I've now done 3 shows about this. One with Eric Hunley, another with Tony Ortega. You can find them on the channel. And on the Eric Hunley show, people were actually commenting that they didn't believe me. And I'm kind of going, so here we've got it, that we have beliefs that are based upon our opinions, our experiences, and our perceptions. And we have beliefs that are based upon evidence. So if we're going to talk about gravity, for example, we can look at it and we can apply the inverse square law, and we can determine things about how things will fall and that they will fall. And that's evidence-based. So what I was saying was, Tom O'Neill has no evidence, none. And people were choosing not to believe me when I quoted extensively. I was so concerned about this, I wrote an article about it. I took some time and put that up on Tony Ortega's site. It'll be up on my new website as well soon. And we've linked it through Steve Hassan's site. Getting into the nitty-gritty of what Tom O'Neill actually says, and he says, that Jolly West had become his great white whale. Well, that's a bad position, comparing himself to Captain Ahab, who was a nutter, and we shouldn't be going around persecuting whales, poor things. They've had a hard time of it.
That's right.
So, and of course, Captain Ahab ended up going on what's called a Nantucket sleigh ride. We were talking about music before and mountains, Nantucket sleigh ride live, incredible, wonderful. But we won't do that right now. The Times Literary Supplement called O'Neill's book a masterpiece. And that is one of the great critical organs. You've got the Kirkus Review, the New York Review of Books, New York Times Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement. They're the greats. And that's how bad it's become, that people can read something and be convinced because it's simply repeated. Now, he's got about 80 pages about Jolly. My thought was very simple. He cites somebody who knew Jolly, briefly it seems, and said he was the most charming psychopath he'd ever met. And I balk at the word psychopath being applied to somebody who I've met and spent time with, and whose reputation I know. Jolly was a friend of Martin Luther King. He went on civil rights marches at a time when you could be shot dead for doing that kind of thing.
Yep. Like for real, like actually shot.
Yeah.
Like for real.
Yeah. Edgar Mevers, Martin Luther King, so many others.
Yeah.
The Mississippi burning, all of that. Horrible.
That's right.
He took that risk. He then, I think 52 is the first time he criticized Hubbard. And he gave a talk at an American Psychiatric Association meeting, and he was frequently honored, by associations for the work he did on drugs and alcohol and helping people, work he did on violence. And he stood up before the APA and said, Scientology is a cult and its leader is a crank, and I will not be intimidated by them. He was sued by them. He kept going out and he kept saying it. And so I'm kind of going, psychopath, this idea that this guy is, wrote the blueprint for MK Ultra, the 146 projects of MK Ultra with no evidence.
That's
so
right.
It bothered me and I needed to speak out. I met Jolly 4 times. We spent several hours together each time. He was one of the few truly brilliant people I've met. He was, his information was staggering. The amount he'd understood. He was a polymath. He had a vast area of expertise. He was funny. He was charming. And somebody said in the comments, oh yeah, psychopaths are charming. It's like, yes, psychopaths are superficially charming. But when you've known them for a few years and you get that they don't shout at the waiter when their fork's dirty, or they do not behave in that way. Somebody told me some years ago, because I mentioned him, and I didn't realize he was there are all these conspiracy theories around Jolly. Tom O'Neill says that he interviewed Jack Ruby after Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And he says in an article that he wrote, O'Neill, that he snapped Ruby into madness during a single interview. He doesn't give us any explanation of how this might be done.
He just makes this claim.
Yeah.
That Jolly West somehow interviewed Jack Ruby and made him crazy?
Yeah.
How do you just toss stuff like that out?
Yeah, and why do so many people believe it?
Well, because they want to. That's why.
Yeah.
I mean,
they don't understand the difference between evidence and opinion.
No,
and
they don't.
Willing to go with their gut. They're willing to go with their instinct, their intuition, what have you. And that is putting the world into terrible danger, that people think that way rather than thinking, with an evidence basis.
That's right. And we need to, I actually want to comment on this for a second, because what you're saying is way, way, way more important as a core principle truth, I think, then I think it needs to be underlined and bold-faced a few times here, okay? Because in terms of like how you and I approach information and how we try to parse out and deal with and figure out what to believe or not, this is how we do it. It's like you, me, everybody has their emotional needs that make us biased toward wanting to believe certain things. But we got to be clear that even in the ex-Scientology world, this kind of stuff goes on. Lies get told, nonsense gets spread around about how bad Scientology is in certain ways, in certain areas, as though we need to do that. As though it's not bad enough. With all the hardcore truths we've given you guys, right, over all these years, and it's been demonstrated on Leah and Alex Gibney and Lawrence Wright and Rolling Stone and everything else, all this stuff, right, years and years, decades from Tony Ortega, of facts, actual information. You can see photos, you can see dates, you can see times, you can see testimonials, you can see real evidence of stuff, and it's really bad. And so it really gets my goat a little bit when I then watch people rewriting history or making it out to be, or exaggerating it to be worse than it already is. And I see that sometimes, and it's always a little teeth gnashing, because the truth is bad enough as it is, and the truth is what lasts. And when you add lies, then the truth forks. It goes off in this direction, and now now we have these whole other narratives that 5 years from now we're still trying to deal with, like this, like Jolly West, full-on character assassination ends up being the product of this, because people are trying to make a name for themselves, or they're trying to stand out, or they're trying to bring something new to the conversation, and there isn't anything new to bring to it. The conversation's the conversation. The facts are the facts. That's all there is. And again, with Scientology, it's bad enough. With Manson, it's bad enough. But we have to embellish. And then people want to believe those embellishments. And I see that happen even in this world, even in the ex-Scientology community, as well as in the big wide world. So I thought I'd throw that out there, because I think all of us could be a little bit more critical about some of the claims we hear, even from people we trust, Just saying.
And we can all make mistakes.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that too.
It doesn't. We have to look at people's motivation. I think I have no reason to suspect Tom O'Neill's motivation. I think that he genuinely believed this. He found that Sidney Gottlieb, who was the architect of MKUltra, had been exchanging letters with Jolly West. Now, he did this under the name Sherman Griffith. And there's no evidence that Jolly knew that Sherman Griffith was Sidney Gottlieb. Mm-hmm. He did this on the letterhead of a company called Chemifrill, and money was paid out. Those 146 projects, they didn't go to people and say, we're the CIA, we're researching mind control, would you like to jump on board?
Right.
They went to somebody who might be doing interesting work. One of the things I pointed out in the article I wrote is that more than 90% of the social psychology experiments that were performed in the United States from World War II into the 60s were funded by the US military. Mm-hmm. Zimbardo was funded by the US military. One of his papers actually has the US Navy listed on it, because they're wanting to find out what the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans have got.
That's right.
And they do grossly unethical things. But some of those experiments, it seems very likely that one of Jolly West's experiments on LSD was funded. But they wouldn't have said this is a check from the CIA. They'd have said, it's the Society for Human Ecology or one of these fronts.
Exactly.
And that experiment was not to harm people. The experiment we know about with Jolly, and it's where O'Neill gets interested, is he had a crash pad in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco where his grad students would sit with notepads and make notes on hippies who'd come in who'd taken LSD. They didn't give them the LSD. They weren't running any mind control experiment. They were seeing what it did. Now, that's within the purview of these experiments. It does not make Jolly West a bad person in any way.
Right.
So, yeah, I've been recording facts about Scientology since 1983, when I first published a newsletter called Reconnection that ran 33 issues. 32 of them are all still online, put up by an independent Scientologist, which is curious because I'd lost faith by the second issue. But I was begged to carry on doing it. And so I wrote a piece in the second Reconnection called So What Really Happened, trying to gather together this, what seemed to be this takeover by the Commodore's messenger organization of Scientology under David Miscavige. And I'd talk to whoever I could get to. By then I'd talk with John Nelson and Harvey Haber and David Mayo and various people, and John Ziegel had put these tapes out, and I was trying to piece it together. And it's always that thing that you're trying to piece together the reality. And the problem will always be that you'll have your own biases, inevitably. There'll be things that you don't want to be true. But you have to get to the point where your own cognitive dissonance, your own dislike, your own confirmation bias, my side bias, that doesn't matter. You are just collecting the facts and assessing the sources. Right. And there were cases. So I was in touch with L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs, and who was very helpful, and the proviso was very simple. I could not publish anything Nibs had said that I didn't have a second source for, because he twice signed documents admitting perjury. And I understand the pressures he was under to do that, which was like he needed some money. He was diabetic and was losing bits of his body as he went along, poor man.
That's right.
He'd got, 6 kids, I think, total, and his father ran a massive harassment campaign against him. So,
if you think the folks who get fair game now are having it rough, you think Leah and Mike are having it rough? Fair gaming when L. Ron Hubbard was still around? Paulette Cooper style, right? Let's drive him to suicide, full on murderous intent.
I certainly was, a similar campaign was run against me.
Yes,
for 16 years.
That's right.
And very much the intention is to drive you out of your mind, destroy all of your relationships. I was sued by one of my closest friends at one point. It's a strange situation to find yourself in.
Yeah, your life infiltrated. Your best friend could be working for the church. I mean, these people were not screwing around. And L. Ron Hubbard Jr. was at the receiving end of decades of this. And the back and forth that he experienced was absolutely understandable given the psychological torture and physical duress even that he was under. And this is his own kid he's doing this to. L. Ron Hubbard is enacting this vengeance on. I mean, my God. So this is the organization we're dealing with. Yeah, it's bad.
He's very terrible. So for me, because I was under constant attack from the moment I left Scientology, because I said, all right, I'm going to talk about this. Not to the press. I didn't talk to the media until March 84. I didn't have any media interviews. And that was to try and rescue things they'd been told that weren't true. And then my career changed a little bit. But I wanted to know what the truth was, whatever it was. And somebody, I was questioned because I did make a mistake in an interview. I said that Quentin Hubbard, the oldest of Hubbard's children by Mary Sue Hubbard, who committed suicide at the age of 22.
Mm-hmm.
There are conspiracy theories that it was murder, but I'm pretty sure it was suicide from reading the coroner's report and interviewing people around at the time.
Yep.
But I said he did the bridge twice. He went through to class 12 twice because an executive in Scientology, when I was in, had told me that this had happened. And I was corrected. Dennis Ehrlich, quite rightly, immediately said, no, he was programmed to do it a second time. But a comment was then made upon that by somebody who is quite well known, and I'm not going to name her. You can go and dig it out, who said, well, if John's wrong about this, how can we trust anything he says? And the answer to that is, if you look to Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, there are nearly 1,200 reference notes. You can go and check my sources, you can see, and you'll find that more than 50% of the material in that book comes from a single source, and that source is Ron Hubbard.
Exactly.
So, when I say that he had a failing grade in molecular and atomic physics and was kicked out of college, he says it too. It's from a lecture.
Well, plus you can also just pull up the transcript. The evidence is the evidence. It's not hard to find.
Yeah, you see, the transcript could be forged.
Well, it could be, but when you're looking at a copy of official document.
I take this standard. I absolutely take this standard because I had to be sure. I had the transcript. I had the transcript before, years later, that I actually heard the tape where he admits it. So 24th September 1950, Introduction to Dianetics. But the point is that you want material that will be convincing to people, so you get him. You say, he's the guy that said this, that make friends with the biggest enemies of the West. That was Ron Hubbard. Let's join SMERSH. That was Ron Hubbard. Zones of Action. Confidential flag order.
That's right.
And so you put that evidence together, and there is something that's Steve Kent asked me to write a chapter for a book he was writing on Scientology and popular culture, and I wrote the chapter, and then the chapter had to be cut down. It was 100 pages that I'd got. It was on UK media on Scientology. We collapsed it to 25 pages, which is what they needed. The publisher, Prager, I went to them and they offered me, the contract was I'd get $80 for this, what by then was 6 weeks of my time, and they would own the copyright, because I went to them and said, look, in a year's time, I'd like to publish the whole thing. Because I don't, I'm here to provide information. This is not about making money. It's not at $80 a pop. It is.
Yeah.
They came back and said, no, we won't let you publish the full thing. So the chapter didn't go in.
Yeah.
But this was a chapter about UK media, and I came to the conclusion that you've come to, that the bias was so evident that. And there was one incident in particular that bothered me, that they opened a Dianetics bookstore in East Grinstead. It was the only time Scientology ever dared to do anything in East Grinstead itself, because St. Hill's 4 miles out. And it was firebombed. Not only was the glass kicked in, I think 4 times, but it was firebombed. And the way it was reported, I was just sort of... No, it sounded as if they deserved it.
Right.
And that kind of, vehement anger is, no. And so I understand why the media don't like Scientology. They sued me quite a lot, so I'm not keen on them either. But to be fair and balanced, to make sure that what you say is true, so that you don't accuse them of something they haven't done. And there is a distinction I'd make between bias and prejudice. Prejudice is where we go to the thing without evidence, prejudice, without judgment, and give our opinion. Bias can be based upon evidence. We can have a bias that's like, I think Charlie Manson was a bad person, for example, and that's my bias. But that's not prejudice. I've now considered a lot of evidence. What bothered me about O'Neill's book was that he didn't mention Scientology once. So I then went off and I read Jeff Gwynn's book, and he mentions it, but he thinks, forgive me, it's a very good book. It's very well researched, but he thinks that Manson got all of his manipulation tricks from the Dale Carnegie course,
Right.
How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he keeps referring back to it. So when you look in the bibliography of Gwynn's book to say, well, what did he find out about Scientology along the way? He evidently didn't have these red box documents that I have.
Right.
And his reference to Scientology is the book, What is Scientology? That's what he found out about them. So of course he doesn't recognize. So in going off and reading Tex Watson's book, Cease to Exist, Watson, of course, was the prime figure in the killings, the Tate and the LaBianca murders. And
he was one of the murderers.
He was the lead.
Yeah.
He was involved in all of it.
And then he himself wrote a book you're referring to here about the whole thing.
Yeah, called when it was republished, it was called Cease to Exist. And of the books I've read, and I've read Manson's autobiography, Dictated to Noel Lemons, twice. And I'm just finishing Diane Lake's book. She was 14 when she was inducted into the Manson family. And she was not involved in the murders at all. She was a witness against the Manson family for nearly 10 years in court. And what is fascinating to me as somebody who does recognize Scientology is, this is where I'd come to. 1962-63, a guy called Lania Raymer, who has, and this is in their documents, Lania Raymer is in McNeil Island Penitentiary and meets Charles Manson and starts auditing him and teaching him Scientology. Now the reason...
Let me interrupt you for just a second. Let me just make sure I'm understanding what we're talking about here, and for the audience's clarification as well. So in 1962, Charles Manson finds himself in prison, connected with this guy, Lania
Raymer.
Lania Raymer. That's a weird name. What is that name?
I don't know. I didn't give it to him.
No, I was just wondering if he was a foreign national. I've just never heard that name before.
Yeah, well, let's face it. You've got Ellis Island over there, so many of the names that people have in America.
Fair enough. It's just an interesting name. So 62, Charles Manson finds himself in jail for. Do you remember what for?
Manson. I think Manson's offences were generally pimping and theft. Those are the things he
Okay, so probably non-violent crime, but he's in there for a period, and he meets this guy who knows about Scientology and actually delivers Scientology processes to him in prison.
Yes.
Okay. Please.
And the report to Mary Sue Hubbard, so their own internal report says that Manson received about 150 hours of auditing in a 14-month period, which is quite a lot.
Yeah.
It's more tand I received in my 9 years in Scientology.
Yeah. It's a lot of auditing.
They also, the report says that Raymer was somewhere around a class 1 auditor.
Okay.
Which at that time, if it was, I haven't checked all the details of this. I don't think they'd reintroduced Dianetics at that point. And the bridge as we have it is that's what, 64, 60, 65.
That's right. 62, there wasn't really a grade chart put together quite yet. There was routine. If I remember right from the bulletins, it was a route. There was a route being put together of routine 1, 2, and 3, and this was stuff that was happening at St. Hill at the time. So yeah, so it was still a little bit roll your own Scientology, but they had very precise procedures for the auditing and for the e-meter use by this point for sure.
Yeah. And Lania Raymer gathered a group of 10 people around him in prison, including Charles Manson.
Okay.
And one of the little notes in the red box documents is to the effect that the reason that Lania Raymer was in prison was because he tried to rob a bank.
No
He tried
shit.
to rob a bank. Yeah, he tried to rob a bank to pay for Scientology.
I was going to say, was he trying to pay for his services? I guess and you guys might laugh, but I'm going to tell you right now, while I was a staff member in Santa Barbara, a professional house thief, burglar, came in and wanted to do services and was being upfront with us about how he made his money. And we were like, nah, dude, you can't do that. You can't be doing that. We didn't turn him in, but we wouldn't take his criminal money because he told us straight up what he was doing. So this happens. This does happen.
Oh, well, what's his name? Is it David Gentili?
Yeah, the whole that whole stock thing that Jeffrey Augustine's been reporting on forever. Yeah,
$1.3 billion Ponzi scheme. So sometimes there are some quite criminal people involved with Scientology, one way or another.
That's right.
So, what in his own book, Without Conscience, which he would later renounce, he spent years with this journalist, Noel Lemons, who was an ex-con who'd known Manson and gone straight. And Manson grudgingly at first started giving him interviews. I'm with Jeff Gwynne on this book. The book is O'Neill just dismisses it again. And I'm going at 200 pages, dictated by Charles Manson. It's like reading Ron Hubbard. I'm not going to presume it's true, but it is information, and it gives me state of mind. And the picture that is painted there has some accurate things in it. Jeff Gwynne writing about it, and again, he only takes, I think O'Neill has one paragraph from it where Manson talks about going to the Tate house, the Polanski house, after the killings, and planting a pair of spectacles there. And that's all you get from a 200-page book. Now, it's true that there are factual errors in this book, and it's true that Manson tries to put himself over, as somewhat better as a human being than he actually was. But nonetheless, it's a source of information.
Mm-hmm.
And he says he got pretty heavily into Dianetics and Scientology. That's Charles Manson himself, pretty heavily into it. We then find that there were 3 other members of the family, and at its greatest extent, the family was 35 people. Mm-hmm. The core group is less than 20 people. There were 3 other people who'd taken Scientology courses.
Really? Do we know the specifics of that?
No, they're listed in the Red Box documents. Bruce Davis is named, and Sandra Good is named, and there's one other. I'm still at the beginnings of my own researches into this. This is coming hot on the presses.
Well, I'm going to tell you, it's 2 is an interesting coincidence. 3 is unlikely. 4 people in a group of 30 who have done Scientology services, and within the last 10 years, right? Because 62 is when Manson does his stuff, and we're coming up to 68, 69, right?
Well, the family begins in 67.
67. Okay.
I thought that I thought I was going to be saying, well, look, we should take this into consideration. Mm-hmm. It probably isn't the most important aspect of what happened. Mm-hmm. And let me say up front, there is even though they may have walked the same corridors, there is no connection that I'm aware of between the Church of Scientology or any of its many hundreds of groups, the Religious Technology Center, the Church of Spiritual Technology, or the International Finance Police. There is no connection that I've found between any official Scientology organization and Charles Manson. Mm-hmm. There is no suggestion that anybody in the Scientology organization was directing Manson in any way. Right. No more than Jolly West was.
Right. And that's that's a very, very important thing to keep in front and center. The other thing to keep front and center with this is the assertion that Charles Manson did Scientology services and that they could have influenced his way of thinking. And eventually could have in some fashion informed some of his behavior is really the kind of the totality of the claim, because that we're going to be making here, because we're not saying Scientology was officially behind Charles Manson in any way, shape, or form. Like as you just said, there's no evidence of that. But the volume of Scientology that was given to him, that was delivered to him, and what Scientology does to a person is the basis of an argument that it could have been influential on him. And the fact that there were 3 other people in his small core group who also had Scientology background. If you know what Scientology is and is capable of doing to you, then that becomes an important piece of information. If Scientology is merely some faith-based, rah-rah to you, and you don't think it's anything more than a Christian revivalism, something like that, then it might not necessarily matter to you that the Scientology connection is sitting there. But it's there, and it's an interesting point of conjecture as to how much is it there and how much could it have been an influence on Manson. And that's basically the core of this thing as I see it today. Yeah.
And you hit the nail on the head. It's what was that influence? Now, what I thought as I came into this, because I've been familiar with these red box documents since the 1980s. So I know how they tried to cover it up, because that's what it is. It's them trying to play down any connection that Manson might have had with them. And one can understand that it's, look what happened to Kool-Aid after Jonestown. Yeah. And that was Flavor Aid's greatest coup, that Kool-Aid had nothing to do with it, but drink the Flavor Aid doesn't sound right.
That's right.
So you don't want to be positioned against Charles Manson.
That's right. Because then he'll go down in history as the Scientology killer.
Yeah.
Can't have, the church doesn't want to have anything to do with that.
No, and nor would any of us, even if it were a church. And I must say that I still object to the use of that word to describe Scientology in any way, because a church is a Christian organization. That's what the word means. And Hubbard was insistent that we study the etymology of words and understand them. And so by his own standards, and we know, you and I both know, that the reason he used the term church was because of the Church of American Science. Which amazingly got its way into the Modern Management Defined Dictionary from the tape he made, where he says it's a Christian church to recruit Christians and move them on to something better, like Scientology. So the whole church thing was a con from the beginning.
That's right.
So I do not refer to it as the church. It seems to me that he's been successful in the scam. If we start saying the good organization, or something like that, I've sort of had to backpedal from the word cult because people get upset about it. But Scientology is indeed an authoritarian, dangerous cult. And there we go. End of that particular rant. The other thing that bothered me about O'Neill was that, having read Manson's autobiography some years ago, there was no mention of Datura. Now,
yeah, this is the other important point that's missing out of the narrative. Please go into detail on this one.
Yeah, Manson and, in fact, Tex Watson both talk about something they call Talache tea. And they both say Watson took this. Watson says that he was arrested in Van Nuys in LA, crawling on his hands and knees among a crowd of school children, saying, beep, 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 beep. He was arrested for being under the influence of drugs. He said that trip lasted for 10 days. Now, here's a coincidence. When I was in LA, I think it was 91, and I had lunch, Steve Hassan, Jolly West, and we had lunch. And Steve, out of nowhere, and Steve doesn't remember this, but it struck me at the time. Steve looked to Jolly. Jolly was one of the world's leading experts on drugs. I mean, how many people have killed an elephant with LSD? One. And Tusco the elephant, it's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
But he knew about drugs. And so Steve said to him, what drug were the Manson family taking? And Jolly said, without a pause, Jimson weed, also known as loco weed. And
If I might for a second, just because I have it pulled up here, Datura stramonium, also known as
whether it's stramonium or inoxa, I'm not sure. That I'm still researching that, but it is the Jimson weed, the loco weed.
Yep, thornapple, Jimson weed, devil's snare.
Yep,
devil's trumpet. It's a musical drug. Poisonous.
That's because of the angel's trumpet. It's also called angel's trumpet for the beautiful flowers. It's not illegal. This terrible drug.
No.
You can buy it on the internet.
Exactly.
It will drive you crazy. It is not. This is not nice stuff. This is not like a happy psychedelic drug. This is a drug class called a deliriant. It puts you into another reality. You are inside a nightmare. Exactly.
That's exactly what it describes here. It's an aggressive, invasive weed across the world, frequently been employed in traditional medicine to treat a variety of ailments, also been used as a hallucinogen, taken to cause intense, sacred, or occult visions. It is unlikely ever to become a major drug of abuse owing to effects upon both mind and body frequently perceived as being highly unpleasant, giving rise to a state of profound and long-lasting disorientation or delirium with a potentially fatal outcome. And that story you told was one of, I'm sure, a legion of bad stories connected with this stuff, but it was available to the Manson family because it grew freely in the hills. Yeah,
that's right. And one of the locals, who I think was a Native American, had told a member of the family about this drug. She was cooking it up, and both Manson and Watson confirm separately the story, which is she was cooking up the root of this plant, and Watson walked in, took the whole piece and swallowed it. And that was in April of 1968. The murders would be at the end of July, beginning of August. And Manson says, and Manson is not a reliable witness, but Manson says he never saw Tex Watson again from April 68 until the trial, when he was not under the influence of Datura. Now, by strange happenstance, not only do we have, of all people, Jolly West telling us this is what was used, along with a lot of LSD and smoking dope and what have you. By the way, Charles Manson was teetotal, just like Hitler. He was also a vegetarian.
When you say teetotaler, you mean no alcohol, or because he was clearly taking drugs?
Teetotal is a reference
just to alcohol,
to the total abstinence from alcohol.
Okay, good.
The temperance movement. That's my understanding of it.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And it's just emphasizing the letter T at the beginning. Teetotal. It doesn't mean you only drink tea.
Okay.
Which could give you problems as well, but not the same ones. So why wasn't this in there? Then I go to Gwyn's book, and he just mentions, Tex Watson took belladonna and was arrested on the sidewalk, but he doesn't tell us what the effects of this drug are. Now, this is one for me. When I was 17, I read a book that referred to the India Hemp Drugs Commission. Now, this was the largest survey of drugs ever performed. It was in the 1890s. I don't think anybody's gone beyond it now. There were 10,000 people interviewed.
Wow.
And, usually gold standard studies stop at 1,000. And all sorts of assertions were being made about the dangers of cannabis. And they produced, I think, 8 volumes. And their conclusion was simple, that cannabis should remain legal. There was no evidence of harm, that the allegations that it was driving people mad. They'd investigated, they'd interviewed more than 200 people who'd been labeled psychotic by the police, who, when they arrested them, said they're obviously stoned. And they interviewed more than 200 people who'd been put into hospitals for this, and not one of them had ever taken cannabis. So that wasn't the problem. Cannabis was ultimately banned because of a same allegation about cannabis is the source of psychosis.
Right.
We now know that isn't true.
That's right.
But the report said cannabis should remain legal, alcohol should remain illegal in India because of its bad effects. Datura should be extirpated. I think it's the first time I ever saw the word extirpated, to pull up by the roots and destroy.
Oh, wow.
Which, of course, the United Nations had this in its charter about cannabis, that it should be destroyed around the world. From in the 60s, they put forward a statement, which they have now withdrawn.
Good.
I'm pleased to say.
Good, because cannabis has been the most like wrongly scheduled drug. But isn't it interesting how this ties into the massive amounts of false information? I mean, almost flat out propaganda campaigns that have been waged by the US and other governments and other religious institutions against drugs to cause them to be so incorrectly scheduled and wrong way too. And alcohol's at the top of the list of everything's great with that, even though it causes far more damage. But I don't mean to get on a stump on drugs. I'm just pointing out that part of the Manson picture that is so bizarre to me that it is not highlighted more comes out of the cultural bias, the cultural prejudice even, of how we thought about drugs during that time that this all went down, and the importance we placed on various substances, because cannabis was the death drug in the 60s. But Datura, this Jimson weed, was ignored, and yet it's a massive red flag in the middle of all this when you're looking at what could cause somebody to go psychotic and in an absolute insane murder fest rage kill these people. What could have caused this? And there it is, right in the middle of the picture, going hi, and everybody ignores it. Except Jolly West, who says, yeah, Jimson weed. They were probably on Jimson weed, guys. And he's the one getting lambasted as the bad guy here. You just can't make this stuff up, you know? I'm sorry, I just had to comment on that because it just drives me crazy, man. It drives me crazy how people do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think you froze for a second there, but yeah.
We're in a reversal that, you know, again, O'Neill says that Manson used LSD to program the family. Now, I'll admit that you can create community using LSD, but you can't program people. And I'm pretty sure it's why Ron Hubbard named it as the worst drug, because people will take an LSD trip and their perspective on the world will change. So it's a deprogramming drug. And that's not necessarily a good thing. You know, you could have routines and habits that are useful to you that go out the window. So I'm not advocating the use of anything. Datura, on the other hand, I talked with an ethnobotanist who was just amazing. And I don't have his permission to name him, but I do want to say, this guy did me such a favor, because I met him 30 years ago, and 30 years later I find him and say, do you know something about Datura? And he immediately, within 24 hours, I've got this long screed explaining what it does. And one of the things he said, and I put it in the article, in fact, I put most of what he said in the article that's on Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker, that Datura is the very definition of a bad trip.
Exactly.
And just the thought, you know, if you're tripping for 10 days, you're not sleeping. If we just forget about everything else and your whole mental process, the brain is cleaned out while we sleep. So this guy is, and you look at Tex Watson. Tex Watson's a kind of straight A's high school graduate who played, you know, for the football team, and he's recruited by Manson, and he twice leaves Manson. And nobody recruits him back. He goes back because of the allure of this group. So I'm kind of thinking, well, you know, Scientology, the study of Scientology has an influence. What has not been understood by these authors, as you said earlier, is this isn't a faith. You know, those of us who are involved don't tend to see it as a religion. We tend to see it as a therapeutic system that teaches you how to gain influence over other people.
That's right.
And Hubbard himself talks about 8C, that habit of, for some reason, not using the infinity symbol, but using an 8 to replace it. 8C, infinite control.
That's right.
And among the things that Manson will have done, we have Training Routine Zero is on the list. They give a list of some of the things they found out. It is almost inevitable, because he was doing control communication havingness processes, objective processes with Lania Raymer, 150 hours. He was doing Training Routine Zero. I am pretty sure he will have done the upper indoctrination training routines.
Were those were not on the list though of what was reported to Mary Sue?
No, and it's a very cursory list, but to have and they also, there's no record of the books he read. Now, Manson claims that he learned to read and write at this time. This is not true. He had a poor reading standard, but he could read and write before then, because there are school reports. He went through a horrifically abusive time in a Catholic reform school from the age of 12. And as he points out, when you only weigh 65 pounds and you're not 5 feet tall, you can have a pretty bad time of it.
Yep.
Now, throughout prison, of course, and he'd spent from the age of 12 to the age of 32, he spent most of his time in institutions. And he's small, and he will have been picked on. And then he learns, well, the media call it the Manson stare. We call it Training Routine Zero.
That's right.
Some people call it the predator stare. And he's being taught a subject. Scientology doesn't pretend about this. It teaches you how to control other people.
That's right.
Even physically, it teaches you how to control other people. Manson picked up tricks from there.
Well, let me point out right now, just as an analogy, with Scientology and in the world of Scientology, because we're talking about Manson's stature and size and puniness, and the fact that he was bullied. David Miscavige, he's a little tiny guy. Very, very physical guy, but tiny. And yet he has thousands at his beck and call, right? He has ultimate power, and he does. I'm not even like joking right now. He does. He can call people before him, and if he wants, and it's been done, he can beat the shit out of them, and they won't fight back.
Yeah.
Right? Or if they do, he's got 3 other guys who will deal with that. So there is something to this. And I want to put that out there, that having been, and John's done this, and maybe people who are listening to this don't know what the hell we're talking about. So let me just say briefly, when we talk about TRs and we talk about Scientology exercises or practical things that it teaches people, these are things that are meant to be empowering, and they are. And they empower you because they teach you, kind of similar with neurolinguistic programming. They're teaching you things that work, and you don't necessarily understand exactly why. And you don't necessarily understand what it's doing. You know that if you stare at somebody in their eyes, you can make a difference in how they think about you and what they do when you give them commands. It's weird. That doesn't mean it's not true. There's something to that. Now, L. Ron Hubbard will tell you, oh, well, it's your thetan and your infinite control and your exerting intention. Maybe. There's other explanations. Doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that Charles Manson would do this, feel empowered by it, because that's the effect it has on people, and he talked positively about it years later, so we know this. And these exercises are meant to put you under control and teach you how to control others. And that's not hyperbolic statement. That's not like, oh, Chris is just exaggerating. No, that's exactly what it was designed for. So even if you go into learning about this stuff in a prison setting, you have a dedicated, trained Scientologist in that prison teaching Charles Manson these techniques. And these are lasting procedures. These are not just, oh, I had a moment. Oh, the Lord overtook took my heart. It's not that kind of thing. It's oh, you're teaching me a skill which I can then use to not be bullied and to have power and control and influence over other people around me. And if there was one thing that definitely would have been of fantastic interest to Charles Manson in 1962, it would have been gaining the ability to have power and control over other people. And Scientology gives that to you. And it's nefarious and it's underhanded and it's manipulative as hell, which is why it's unethical, which is why we decry it. But that doesn't mean that it can't work or that people don't do it and get results. And they do. And that needs to be said here. And maybe this has all just been kind of understood in the conversation here. So I realized maybe we should say this out loud for people, that this experience that Manson could have had in prison could have been incredibly influential. And that is why we're harping on it. So, sorry, John, back to you.
No. Harp away.
Yeah.
You know, when we first met at Toronto, we did a presentation, which is on my channel, with Steve Hassan and Christian Sturko, where we analyzed some auditing techniques and some training routines. Right. And we had a good time with training routine 8, where Christian, you taught Christian how to put his intention into an ashtray.
That's right.
Very successfully. Ashtrays now just rise up off chairs whenever he walks past.
That's right.
But there's, you know, this isn't hidden at all. This is, you know, one of the procedures or a set of procedures that Manson did in prison are called control, communication, havingness processes.
That's right.
Havingness is getting stuff. Communication, I think we know what that means. But control is the front end of that. I thought that, you know, as I looked into this, I thought, well, I've got a story here, you know, that people should be looking into this. That's my story. And people should be looking at the Scientology connection a bit more deeply. And people should be looking at the use of Datura more deeply.
That's right.
Because when you add these things in, the picture changes. But I expected that what I'd find would be that Manson had this involvement. Yeah, it went on for a while, and it had taught him how to stare and little bits and pieces maybe. But it didn't seem to me to be essential to the Manson story. And then I started finding some things out that are not obvious unless you know what you're looking at. So, for example, he believed in reincarnation. Okay, that's fair enough. He believed in reincarnation. That's a core Scientology belief, but it's a core belief for probably 2/3 of the world's population.
That's right. I mean, including Christians from a certain point of view in terms of eternal life in heaven.
Yeah, that you'll have an incarnation there, but he
right.
believed in it in the way that Scientologists believe in it, which is not the same way that Hindus and Buddhists believe in it. To a Hindu or a Buddhist, reincarnation is called the fear of the eternal return. The most terrifying thought to a Hindu or a Buddhist is the thought they'll be born again. It's not a good thing.
Oh, that's a flavor of that I'd never picked up before. That's interesting.
Yep. The wheel of suffering.
Ah,
Reincarnation
right.
is the wheel of suffering. You want to stop suffering. You want to enter nirvana. Or if you're a Hindu, you want to become part of the great spirit, Paramatman. So you are dissolving yourself. You're getting rid of the self. Now, the Scientology New Age view is, yeah, I'll do it in my next lifetime. You know, well, no, you'll be reborn as an earwig. So it's not a good thing to look forward to. You know, the Hindu thing, you've got like 80,000 incarnations before you become human again. So watch out here, make a good job of it. So, but Manson takes it as a positive thing in the same way that Scientology does. But then I ran across the word postulate. And when I found, and it's in Diane Lake's book.
Really?
She suddenly starts talking about Charlie postulating things and teaching them to postulate things. Now, the word postulate, as far as I understand it, is a basic philosophical premise. That's its meaning. It's a word that was hijacked by Hubbard and redefined in simple terms to mean wish. And as far as I know, it's unique to Scientology in that meaning.
Correct.
Scientology derivatives.
That's right. I've not seen it used that way. It's used in science and stuff as put forward an idea, postulate a thing, right? But Hubbard absconded with it. And in fact, I'm looking up right now. I got the dictionary, the Scientology dictionary in front of me right now. And postulate is defined in numerous places in Scientology, and it is exactly in Scientology a self-created truth. Would be simply the consideration generated by self. Well, we just borrow the word, which is in seldom use in the English language. We call that postulate. And we mean by postulate self-created truth. He posts something. He puts something up, and that's what a postulate is.
Yeah, and we came to understand it, the Thetan has the ability to postulate and to perceive. Those are the two abilities that the spirit, the self, has. That's
right.
your lot. You can postulate and you can perceive. And by postulate there, he is talking about making something come into being. You postulate it, it comes to exist. It's a fundamental idea that, he made negative comments about Mary Baker Eddy before he started Scientology, and this ridiculous idea that you could control the world through thought. And then he cashed in on it.
Exactly. That's right. He was knocking the competition while literally doing the exact same thing. That was Hubbard to a T.
And from that, we've got The Secret and the Law of Attraction.
That's right.
We had, Trump's guru,
Oh, God.
Norman Vincent Peale,
Yep.
The Power of Positive Thinking. We've had so many of these things, which, it doesn't really bear thinking about that, the idea that one of 7.5, 8 billion people, let alone the clams and earwigs on this planet, is determining everything that happens so that they'll get an ice cream or something. That it's just a silly narcissistic inflation when a human being thinks that they are determining the weather or the outcome of sporting events from their power of wishing. There was a huge experiment performed by Christians to show the power of prayer, and unfortunately it didn't work.
Sorry, guys.
There was nothing. But as somebody wrote to New Scientist, the only reason it didn't work was that he was praying that it wouldn't work.
Of course.
Suddenly Diane Lake is talking about Charlie postulating things.
Yeah.
So we've got a fundamental Scientology notion that's moved in here.
Yeah.
And he also used space hand mimicry.
Did he?
Where he would get his followers to put hand up against and try and follow his hand, which of course is from the communication control havingness process.
That's right.
Which he received from Scientology.
That's right.
And hypnotists will point out this is a way of bringing somebody into, it's called pacing by hypnotists. You get somebody to follow what you're doing, or you follow their breathing, and then you can change and they will follow you. It's like in Dead Poets Society, where Robin Williams has all the boys walking and they fall into lockstep.
That's right.
And he says, and quite rightly, this is a natural phenomenon called pacing by hypnotists and used in objective processes by Scientology. That's and right. Used by Charles Manson quite frequently. Elsewhere,
and I want to point out, just for everybody to know this, you don't have to know why something works in order for it to work. It's not necessarily part of the picture here that Charles Manson was an evil genius who understood every little nuance of this stuff. With people like that, one of the things I've made a point about cult leaders for some time now is that, because it's an important one, is that often they just kind of organically, circumstantially fall into this position. Manipulate events. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's all an accident. But they don't always necessarily understand what they're doing. They just know if they do this and this and this, it works. And so here, if we look at this timeline of events and go, well, in 1962, he's introduced to all this stuff in a very intensive fashion in a short period of time in prison, and he uses some of it, and it looks like it works. Maybe he didn't get beaten up. Maybe he actually got somebody to do what he wanted for once, and he goes, hey. And here he is applying these procedures later. So I just wanted to make that point that it's not necessarily evil genius driving this sometimes. Sometimes it's just, this works and I'm going to keep doing it. Yeah.
And to me, I think there's a tremendous difference between cunning and intelligence.
Yeah.
Ron Hubbard's never, never really struck me as an educated man. He's not well read. He occasionally refers to Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire or the 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
That's right.
But he doesn't, he doesn't refer to major literature. He makes mistakes. So in of all places, the false data stripping policy.
Yes.
He talks about the syllogism
yes.
being developed by Socrates. And of course, as he says in the Phoenix Lectures more correctly, 23 years before, it's Aristotle, a pupil of Socrates' pupil. So I'd just like to strip that false data. There may be people that think false data stripping works because they have false data on it.
Exactly.
But it was in fact Aristotle. He's not, his references to literature are minimal. He doesn't appear to be in the least bit well read.
Oh no, he dedicate one of the books to.
He also exhibits.
Didn't he dedicate one of the books to Korzybski, and then later on admitted in a lecture he never read him?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's 8008 has Korzybski, and what I learned was I was in touch with A. Van Vogt, the great science fiction writer, who stopped writing the moment he met Dianetics and spent the rest of his life. I was in touch with him like 34 years later, and he had not written anymore, which really annoyed me because I think he was one of the great storytellers, really was, of the golden age of science fiction. Much better storyteller than Ron Hubbard, in fact, but we won't get into that. But there's this thing about, I've lost my thread.
I am so sorry that I totally threw you off there with that, and I apologize. But you were we were going on about Manson and the TRs and controlling and the postulate word, and then I kind of derailed with the references to Korzybski and stuff there. But you were on a path on going from the
Korzybski.
Yeah.
That Van Vogt wrote a novel called The World of Null, which is an attempt to explain Korzybski, and both Van Vogt and Sarah, the bigamous second wife, I had no second wife, who gave him the child Alexis. I had no children with her either. I just looked after her because she looked very much like me, and then threatened to chop her up and throw her in the river in Cuba when she was a year old. There are so many stories around this man.
Yeah.
That they both had read Korzybski, and probably Science of Survival is an attempt to get on the bandwagon of Science of Sanity, the great Korzybski book, which I also haven't read. But there are certain ideas like infinity valued logic that's in Science of Survival. That comes from Korzybski. The map is not the territory. The word is not the thing itself.
That's right.
The idea underneath.
See, Sarah probably explained it to him one night. Is probably what happened.
Van Vogt told him a bit about it.
Yep.
And that seems to be how he got most of his ideas.
That's right.
He probably subscribed to the Reader's Digest because he did not have the attention span to study anything in depth, and he just grabs, like it looks as if the study tech came from the Eastman Kodak course he was studying, which he keeps talking about. I've not managed to get a hold of it, but so he'll just grab something, and as he says, to make something persist, you must enter a lie into it. And that's something all Scientologists should think about. Why does Scientology persist? What's the lie? The lie is that it works. There you go. Very simple. It will actually, you'll be chasing your tail forever. You won't achieve any of the abilities that you've been promised from the start. It doesn't happen.
That's right. But the point the point there being, of course, that, or a point that could emerge from this that I wanted to say out loud is that even Hubbard might not have fully understood everything he was actually doing to people. He just knew the effects, and he went, I like that effect. I'll just make up a reason why. It's your Thetan, it's your overts, it's your missed withholds, it's your out list, it's your, he's got a laundry list of things in Scientology as to why people act the way they do. None of it's true, but it sounds so good.
And that's a good story.
Yeah, it's storytelling.
Yeah, and it oversimplifies everything about the human process.
That's right.
But the point, it's again, L. Ron Hubbard Jr. Scientology works not as L. Ron Hubbard says it works, but as L. Ron Hubbard intends it to work.
That's right.
And as L. Ron Hubbard himself said, we have ways of making slaves here.
Yep.
Now, he then says, let's make sure none are made. It's in the Philadelphia Doctorate course. And I was told off by their lead lawyer, Kendrick Moxon, for just quoting the first part of the statement. So if Kendrick is watching today, there you go. However, he didn't make sure that none were made. And most certainly Scientology is guilty of human trafficking, of modern slavery. And, reading Janice Gillam Grady's account of her time in the Commodore's Messenger Organization, she was the founding member of the CMO, the age of 12. She talks about the Apollo being a slave ship.
Yep.
And I think that's an accurate reflection. So what I'd say is that what Manson, and I agree with you, I don't think any of these gurus really understand the techniques. I think that you and I probably understand them a great deal more deeply. I've spent 40 years pulling out these techniques and writing about them. So I know that if you stare at something, you get the Ganzfeld effect, where your perception will be distorted because the brain's not getting any feedback, or the mind is not getting any feedback. So you sit in a completely dark room, within 10 minutes, you'll hear things.
Yep.
You'll hear the feedback in your own brain. Yep. You will sense things moving around you. So anything that brings, fixation, repetition, and mimicry, they're my three. You do any of those things to somebody and you'll put them into a different state of mind.
Yep.
An altered state of mind.
That's right.
Where they will very often feel euphoric and they'll feel great. So it's a good thing you've done. Well, that's nothing. Therapy is not about feeling great. Therapy is about getting better relationships. And Scientology does not do that.
Exactly. It worsens them.
Yeah, and destroys them often as not.
Oh, because it makes them, and it can't help it. I mean, just since we're off on this little eddy here for a second, and it's a good one, they can't help themselves. You understand? It's not that Scientology has these little gems, and if we could just excise them and put them there without all the other stuff, then it would be great. That's not how this works. It's you break it down and you realize these are methods of control. Yeah. And they are assigned a level of interpretation that makes it look and sound as though free will is involved, choice is involved, and you're having a great time freeing your thetan. And those are just interpretations of what are control methods that actually make you more introverted, more introspective, in a negative way, right? Like constantly questioning yourself and your motives and intentions. And that's never a good thing, by the way. And makes you self-doubt, puts you in a constant loop of self-image, like derangement. You're constantly thinking about, is it me? Is it my reactive mind? What's going on here? Oh, it's just my overts. I mean, the loop just plays on an endless stream. And this is what Scientology does to you. And you're chasing these highs, these euphoric moments that are not hard to create. But then, like I said, this interpretation is put on it, this spin, so to speak, that always puts you back under Scientology's control. Oh, you like that? Well, we're not done yet. You got so much more to do, and it's only $10,000. And, right? And it's constantly spinning you right back to where you started. And I really want to stress that, because these things are not good. They're not moral. They're immoral. They're immoral approaches to helping people. And that's really the core of what Scientology is really all about. And you give it to somebody like Manson, and they can kind of see right away what this can do for them. And they're not thinking about it from, oh, I'm going to help all these people. This is a personality that wants power and control and influence over other people. And here's a tool set that makes that so much easier to accomplish. That's what we're really kind of getting down to, and what Manson learned in prison, and what this stuff is really all about. So just because you have a positive effect and somebody's smiling doesn't mean you've done them a favor.
Well, and if we look at it, absolutely, I agree with you. If we look at it in clinical terms, what Scientology and many, many other systems do is induce hypomania.
There you go.
They induce a state of unnatural happiness.
Yes.
Undeserved, unuseful happiness. And, I was talking with this lovely man. We'll put up a video with him, which I recorded, a man called Jon Atack, who's has a psychology PhD, and his study has been large group awareness trainings, best landmark forum, and how they, over a period of days, will break you. And his story is quite fascinating. He had a manic episode in 2003. So he was a business guy, and he really didn't want to do this again. So he found out everything he could. He's a very smart guy. And then in 2010, he went on to a large group awareness training in LGAT, and they talked about the transformations you'd achieve. And he went, but they're the symptoms of hypomania. And so he watched the course from that perspective, went on and did a PhD studying this. And he's come up with the straightforward idea, because it's been so much studied in bipolar disorder, that what you're doing is, by stressing somebody, by putting them in the hot seat, by tearing them down in front of a group of people, by fairly typical day in the STEA organization, I know, you put that stress on them, they will produce more dopamine in response to it, to try and maintain homeostasis of the brain. And then you pull the stress away, and you say, now you've achieved enlightenment, and all that dopamine floods, and you get the faith healing response. You get, the adrenaline, the opioid response, the oxytocin, the serotonin, all this great stuff is kicking about.
Yep.
And for about 3 days, maybe longer, there are people, I've read accounts of people staying in this state for 40 years, but for about 3 days, you'll be high. Then Scientology has it, the roller coaster. Then you'll get the collapse, because you're no longer producing a sufficient amount of this chemistry.
That's right. That's right.
And so you just have that auditing junkie sort of thing. I felt high then, and I want to feel high again. Cocaine is so much less damaging,
Oh my God, I'm telling you.
Absolutely not recommending cocaine here.
No.
It's less damaging.
No, but I saw it with my own eyes. I did. I saw pre-clears, people, Scientologists, right, coming into the org, desperate for their fix. And that's the only way to describe it. We're analogizing it to drugs, but I'm telling you, that's what it looks like. That's what it sounds like. Even at the time, I was disturbed by it. As a Scientologist, I was like, damn, this woman is a little scary, because she was like, yesterday I felt so good, and today I only feel normal, and something must be wrong. And so, so she had to get back in session. And she was paying for it, so of course we were going to put her back in session, and, just feeding the junkie. And that's, I just don't know how else to describe it.
I watched a documentary about Ye, the man who, the artist formerly known as Kanye West.
Right.
Ye. And a woman who came up with him, she was doing slam poetry when he first emerged and before he made a reputation. And she was later diagnosed with bipolar, as he has been. And she said something I thought was incredibly astute, which was, of course, when you're in hypomania, you think that's your normal state. That's where you want to be.
That's right.
There are serious problems with hypomania. One of them is that your judgment is shit.
Yep.
We cannot, when we get too high, we can't make, our discernment goes, and we then write a success story and go to the registrar and borrow £10,000 that we haven't got, and away we go.
That's right. God, that nails it so well. I mean, it's those states that you're trying to get people in Scientology when you are trying to get money out of them, or you're trying to recruit them. And
Yeah.
and we would do that, man. We would do that. We either sock them in or blow them out of their head. Either place, they were in a position where they were so much easier to control.
Yeah. You either go for the fear of worsening.
Yep.
This is going to get worse, isn't it? Or you go for the high that they're going to get.
That's
and
right.
they become controllable. Earlier, you used the Scientology term in talking about what's happening during the auditing process. You said when somebody is given a command, and that is, of course, the word that Hubbard uses for what the rest of us would call questions. He's actually using the hypnotist term. You command the person. And of course, when he talks about hard selling, and I should be promoting here, we've just released the audio book of Scientology, The Cult of Greed. And in there, this is the stripped down, complete guide to what Scientology really is. And yeah, you get to that point where you're being commanded to do something. You're being ordered to do something.
That's right.
And when we get to hard selling, I put together in a page of his hard sell statements that you treat people, they're already in a hypnotic state. That's the way you look at the people around you.
That's right.
And you order them to do things, you command them to do things, you push them around. And there's the foundation of what we're talking about with Manson, that he found a system where you could. And it's amazing when you see Derren Brown or somebody doing it, that you can just, with about a third of the population, you can just tell them what to do and they'll do it.
That's right.
So one of the ones that Derren Brown did, it was he'd go to the racetrack and he'd have a ticket on a losing horse, and he'd put the ticket down, smack the window and go, "That's the one." And about a third of the time he got paid on tickets that were for losing horses, because it's that simple. Another one is a trick that came out of the Moscow underworld that Derren Brown then tried out. You walk up to somebody and you use a confusion technique, which is foundational to hypnosis. Get them confused and you've got control. So you hand them your bottle of water while asking them a question, while asking them directions. And then you say, "Give me your wallet and your keys." And again, about a third of the time, and you see him on camera doing this, and people are giving him their things. And in Russia, they had this problem. It's like, is this actually a crime?
Right.
You said, "Give me your stuff," and you gave it, and you see people walking away and they get like 10 paces and you can see the confusion. What just happened? So
Yep.
as Hubbard said, and as Manson found, people can just be directed to do things.
That's right. The difference
another-
between what we're doing and what Derren Brown's doing versus what Manson and Hubbard did is we analyze it, break it down, tell you the anatomy of it, and then we don't do it because we realize how evil it is, right? I mean, this has actually been a little bit of a problem for me over the years, because there have been times when I've been like, I have access to information. I mean, I could do things with people. I could mess with people. And you just don't. And I have always wondered why I don't. And I'm always like sitting there going, well, Chris, you don't want to, because I don't want to hurt people or mess with people that way. And it's just kind of impossible for me too. But it's really funny how people can get this information and not even understand it as well as we do. And they can make millions with this stuff. It's mind blowing. Really is.
Yeah. And let's stop messing around. Let's just start our own cult.
Right? I'm telling you.
Doing this? I realized about 20 years ago that I knew more about this than Ron Hubbard did.
Yeah.
Because I've spent so much time, I spent 20 years then studying it.
That's right.
And you're kind of going, yeah. When I left Scientology, I had 4 friends who studied neuro-linguistic programming. And they wanted me to do it too. And I said, look, I've just spent 9 years learning how to control people, and I've decided it's wrong. I've decided that magic of any kind, where you're trying to get somebody, you're intending somebody to do something without their consent, is unethical. And that's all there is to it.
Yep.
Giving them a love token so that somebody will fall in love. No, it's all wrong. And so I studied NLP, Ericksonian hypnosis, this kind of stuff from the outside. I talked with people who do it, and there are people who do it ethically. Of course there are, hypnotherapists. But I would say that it's important to understand how it works and what's going on to the extent that we can understand that.
That's right.
And then, and so often over the years, people have come to me and said, "Oh, John, you must be doing these things because you know how to do them." And it's like, that's like telling a doctor that he's giving people diseases.
Right.
I'm here telling you how it works so that it won't work, but it scares people. It's, they know this stuff happens, but they don't want you to understand it because you might use it. And you're kind of going, well, in fact, and we should have a whole thing about this, the state of hypnosis, of being able to enter trances, is useful and you can use it. And if you don't know how it works all the time, 24/7. It's always there. I mean, one of the big lie in Scientology and much of psychotherapy and religion is this idea that there's this alien being inside you that is invisible to you, that is controlling you, whether it's the reactive mind, the unconscious mind, demons, body thetans, whatever it is. It's not true. Unless you have a psychiatric illness, it's not true. There is no unconscious mind. There's not an agent in there directing you. There are unconscious processes, and they're part of your whole being, and you can be aware of them at different levels. But there's not a little evil id or superego sitting in there directing you. And that fear, putting that fear into people, that they're body thetans, Hubbard himself, as we know from Serge Faust, went to his death believing that the body thetans had taken over, and maybe they had, who knows.
He certainly was terrified of them, but that's exactly right. Is that anyway? This is just really important stuff. I'm glad we're saying these things out loud right now.
Yeah, it all needs to be said and thought about, and hopefully, our commentators will add to this picture as they so often do, and give us more insight into it, because this is a community effort. This isn't a matter of L. Ron Hubbard handing down wisdom to the people. This is us investigating, exploring, and being willing, because of what science is, being willing, if there's better evidence, to change our hypothesis of what's happening.
Exactly.
But returning to Manson, another thing that was said about him by several people was that he could change his behavior, and he called it changing hats.
Did he?
Is, I found very interesting, because here we have deep Scientology, changing your beingness, changing your persona, according to. Now, of course, we were drilled in that in terms of emotional tone. We were taught, and I don't know how much of a minority I was in, but I refused to ever use the tone scale to bring somebody down. When I was told that you've got to do that, I think I did the drill once. And after that, it was like, that's not me. I don't want to upset people. I would never use fear of worsening to recruit somebody. It just seemed incredibly manipulative to me, and it is. But he talks about.
I'll say it. I did it. It is. I own it. I did it a lot. You try to drive people down, and through their guilt and shame, you can control them just as much as through their euphoria.
Yeah. And through, of course, phobia, through fears, and through disgust, through aversion, that's a major player in the indie wars, that people are using aversion. You've associated with this person, therefore you are loathsome. And it's like, I'll associate with anybody. I'll talk with anybody. I've talked with people whose views are diametrically opposed to my own. I will talk with sexists, with racists, with fascists, whatever you like. I will talk with them, because that way I might be able to effect a change of some kind by shunning them. And we talked about this in our cancel culture video. By shunning people and ideas, we get nowhere. We just have people with megaphones yelling at people to F off, and it really gets nowhere. So we have him. So I'm getting all of these little bits of information, and I'm kind of going, I'm going to have to write about this.
Yep.
because nobody seems to have. And then I get the mind-blowing piece of information. I thought, yeah, he's got some Scientology stuff. He thinks he's the reincarnation of Jesus. He tells his followers he's the reincarnation of Jesus, man, son of man. Now, just as a little footnote, his mum was 16 when she gave birth to him. She was rebelling against a puritanical mother. And his father was not called Manson. She married a guy called Manson. So just as Ron Hubbard, if we trace back his father, was not called Hubbard, he was born Wilson. So, we should have L. Ron Wilson. There is no, Harry Ross Hubbard was adopted. Yeah, you see, this
Harry Ross Hubbard's father was an adopted child?
Harry Ross himself was adopted, and his birth name was Wilson, not Hubbard. So all of the stuff about the Hubbard name, forget it. Ron Hubbard is the son of somebody who was adopted by people.
I did
Hubbard.
not know that.
No, see, come here and you find.
Yeah, right. Look at that. Look at that. Okay, interesting. Please carry on.
Manson fundamentally teaches his followers that Helter Skelter is going to come. Not one of the Manson family knew what a Helter Skelter was. It's probably a very British thing. It's a conical building that has a slide on it that goes round. You sit on a coconut Akoya mat and down you go. And that was how we used to get our fun before the internet and television. So, but none of the Manson family knew that it's a child's entertainment, and they thought it was this, that Paul McCartney had written this song about this terrible thing. And this was going to be a war between the blacks and the whites. Manson did say that he felt that the blacks would win and should win because they'd been oppressed. I don't think he knew statistically what the ratio of black to white people is in the US, because it would be a stretch for them, for that to happen.
Yeah, it would have been.
It's like the Jews running all of America. Well, only 2 million of them there.
Right.
Out of 350. Come on.
Yeah. Exactly.
Zionist organized government, indeed. So Manson's got this. He seems to have been quite careful in talking about blacks. He himself grew up in a completely racist system. Of course, the institutions he was in would have been segregated. He wouldn't have spent much time with black people. And, the system looked down on them. He is not a civil rights baby, but he seems to have been very careful in talking to the family not to use the N-word. He talks about blackie. That's the word he uses. And he says the blacks will take over. And by that time, we will have found the bottomless pit in Death Valley. And they were exploring Death Valley looking for this Eden that the Manson told them about. It's underground. And yet trees grow there. Now, I have a bit of a problem with that. I understand that trees need light. That could just be me being difficult.
Well, obviously it is, John. I mean, you're just letting facts get in the way of a very, very epic tale here.
A good story, yeah.
Never let that happen.
And the members of the family didn't understand that the bottomless pit is a reference to hell, which is kind of interesting. And Manson told them there are 12 different trees and they have a fruit for each month of the year. We won't need to go dumpster diving to get our food anymore, which is how they got their food.
Yep.
For the most part. And we will find this. We'll go and hide there. And then the black people, having taken over the US, will realize, get this, they're not smart enough to run it. And they will come looking for the second coming of Jesus.
Wow.
Charlie.
That was his narrative?
And the amazing thing is, I've had to pull this story from all over the place. And it's pretty straightforward. It's like when I came to write the cosmology of Scientology and I sell these people a piece of blue sky. And I realized that there was nowhere in Scientology where the cosmology is written down.
Yep.
You've got all of these books like Fundamentals of Thought, Problems of Work, that are meant to be simplifying it. And you've got all of the data series about the importance of information and prioritizing being so important. It never happened.
That's
and
right.
so as far as I know, the only place you can read the cosmology of Scientology is in my book.
Well, it's in mine as well, because I broke down all the OT levels. But yeah, it's why Scientology.
before the beginning was the cause.
Yep.
before the beginning was cause, life is basically a static. We're all separate, R247 separateness, pulling all those things together. I'm sorry, Chris, I wrote this 20 years before you left.
Oh, no, you nailed it, man. I'm not trying to take your thunder. I'm just saying you're right.
You're just saying that somebody else has also done it.
It's just not laid out anywhere. That was what was so. I mean, when I was doing my round, when I was 20 years later, right, when I got out, I was sitting there going, well, hell, there's this whole track reference, there's this Marcab reference, there's this, and it's not laid out anywhere. And it's kind of like, well, how am I supposed to think about the universe and life and everything? And I realized all my time in Scientology was spent trying to put that picture together, and it was a very incomplete puzzle. And I had pieces here and here and here, and I kept waiting for it to coalesce into a whole, and it never did. And I kept being told, well, you just got to do the OT levels. It's all on the OT levels. The OT levels will cover it. And I finally get out, and I read the OT levels, and they didn't cover shit. And I was like, what the hell is this? And you really realize that the big picture is all just a little bit of hints and clues and pieces that you're putting together yourself. And Scientologists all individually have very different ideas about the big picture because of this problem. And yet all of us thought we were on the same page. It was one of the biggest illusion busting things I've ever done in my life. I couldn't believe how little there is there. And yet how complete we all thought it was. And anyway, I'm just ranting here, but it's just, when you said the word cosmology, you trigger all this in me.
And in the end, the truth is that there's a little guy standing on a stool with a megaphone behind a curtain.
Yeah.
And he's called the Wizard of Oz.
That's right.
And that's all right. You get.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So the bombshell, he's reading the book of the Revelation of St. John the Divine, and he thinks this is what's happening, and he's, got all of these girls who most of them are runaways, as young as 14.
Yeah.
And he's pimping these girls because the other part of his training, of course, was he was a pimp.
Yep.
And he was studying with pimps in prison, and having looked at the techniques of pimps along the way of, I think I've looked about the techniques of just about everybody, and they're the same. The recruiting techniques of Al-Qaeda are the same as the Moonies.
Correct.
Because the same things work. And so, he's got this idea of controlling people. He's learnt the pimp stuff. He's added Scientology to it. But I'm really thinking, Chris, I'm really going, he's got this Scientology going on. I'm going to point that out, and it's all going to be fine. And it's not the main picture. You've got Datura, that needs to be underlined. And then I find out one piece of information that sends everything wild. In 1968, so we're more than a year and a half after he starts the family, he sends 2 of his followers to England to study Scientology.
What?
1968.
What?
9 months before the Tate murder, the Gary Hinman murder, the first one. Yep. Now, think about the cost of plane tickets at that time. They're dumpster diving to get their food, and he comes up with the money to send 2 people on return tickets to England to study Scientology. Now, the date was what got me. This was somewhere around October 1968, and I just immediately went, there's only one thing he was after there. He's after OT3.
Exactly.
It was released in June in Edinburgh.
I was just about to look it up. So June is when RJ67 comes out.
Yeah, happy starts with David Mayo and Captain Bill, and up in Edinburgh.
Wow.
And I don't, let's go one step worse. One of these 2 guys doesn't come back. He dies in England. We've no idea why. There's a whole Manson network of conspiracy about what happened, but one of them doesn't get back. I don't think they managed to get OT3. I think they, probably were meant to steal it. And from my interviews with, Robert Kaufman, David Mayo, Captain Bill, I interviewed people who were there and I read all the material around it. I don't think anybody got their hands on that material. No. And I don't think it matters because it wouldn't have been useful in any way to Charles Manson.
No.
What's important in this is that he was still that interested and he still believed that Hubbard had things that he could benefit from. So,
and that he was still on the lines enough, aware enough to know that he had to send people over to England. He couldn't just send them over to LA org.
That's right.
Right? That's something.
Yeah.
That's something.
Yeah. You could get OT3 on the ship.
Yep.
But for that, I believe at that time you'd still have to have been Sea Org.
Yep. But England was the causeway, was the throughway. If you wanted to get to Hubbard, you were going to have to report to St. Hill, and then you'd get further instructions from there, because they were in hiding out on the ocean, quite literally, and their security, they were either on the ocean or they were out down in Tunisia or something, and they were doing cutouts, and they were having people travel here and then here and then here and then picking them up. It was a whole security apparatus they had set up. And I'm not saying it was Fort Knox. I'm saying they were very, very paranoid people, and they were taking great degrees of caution to protect L. Ron Hubbard, protect his whereabouts, and safeguard, those advanced course materials. But really what they were doing was safeguarding Hubbard, who was at this point a tax evader, criminal, and, was all but kicked out of 2 countries. So.
Well, he'd been thrown out of the UK and illegally entered after being named under the Aliens Act as an undesirable
did he go back
alien.
After that? Okay.
Yeah, they landed and smuggled him ashore. I think it was Hannah Whitfield who told me about that.
Oh, okay.
But so he was listed, and so right. Let's just point out that according to his emotional tone scale, that hiding is -8.
That's right. That's right. And he'd also been kicked out of Rhodesia in 1966. And I mean, like, unceremoniously, like, get the hell out of here. It wasn't like, oh, we have a little technicality with your passport. It was like, we want you gone, dude. Like out. Don't come back.
Yeah, and then that story's not really been told often enough, because he would make up the story about he couldn't survive as an OT on his own.
That's right.
In Rhodesia.
That's right.
But he wasn't on his own.
No, he was not.
And the reason he was kicked out of Rhodesia is that the man he'd instructed to steal material from government officers was caught. I interviewed that man. His name was Morley Glazier. He and his brother Neville were very dedicated Scientologists, and until that happened, and Morley ends up in prison in Rhodesia, and Hubbard, who is the OT who can't survive on his own, is thrown out. So yeah, and you've had inquiries in Rhodesia, South Africa, 2 Australian states, the UK and Canada, and he is persona non grata, and he's in hiding, and he would stay in hiding for the rest of his life. His tone level never went up above that again.
It's true. It's hilarious. It's a funny thing it's a funny Hubbard riff on Hubbard, but it's true. It's absolutely true. This dude went into hiding and he never came out. And even he needed relief from it at one point when he left the ship in 1974 to go to New York for a few, like 9 months or something. But even then, right, almost got caught. Off he goes. I mean, he was just not, Hubbard was the exact opposite of OT in every way from the point he invented the OT levels forward. I mean, I never really thought about it from that perspective before, but when you frame it that way, you go, God damn, it's true. He was never his own man. He was never at cause over his life at all because he was such a criminal. He was just such a raging criminal, and he couldn't help himself.
And he was totally reactive.
Yeah,
he reacted.
That's right.
He didn't organize. He coped. I think Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, one of its titles along the way And it's still listed in the bibliography of Russell Miller's Barefaced Messiah as Hubbard Through the Looking Glass.
Oh, that's right.
And
That's right.
which was my preferred title until I heard Don Rogers say, on the day we opened the Dianetic Institute, he turned to me before opening the door and said, "Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky." And he most certainly did. Through the Looking Glass, the simple way of, with Hubbard, he also said, if you become too incredible, you become invisible. And that's the truth.
Yep.
So it's very hard to believe, but it is the truth, that he's the opposite of what he claimed to be. Yeah. I mean, Chris Owen tells me that he started working on what will hopefully be the definitive history of Scientology's harassment. And Chris is the man to write it, just an incredible historian. But he said that what stimulated him to write this was he saw a paper I'd written called Scientology, Religion or Intelligence Agency.
That's right.
And I came to the point of view that Scientology was there to protect and serve Ron Hubbard. It had no other function. And it's we talked about this before, but it's a magical ceremony. It's a ritual. The whole of Scientology is a ritual to elevate and deify L. Ron Hubbard. When Marty Rathbun, it was about 2014 when he was still pretending to be a good person occasionally, he, in one of his blogs, said, Hubbard was seeking apotheosis. And I wrote to him and said, you can see me saying that in 1990 in Blue Sky. And I didn't get a reply.
No, of course not.
Very clearly, it's through the looking glass. Everything is the reverse of what it seems to be. You're being told you will get total freedom. And as Ron Hubbard said, total freedom is, of course, a trap. And here's the road to it.
Exactly. That's right.
The white tape route to slavery.
That's right.
Good.
Oh, it's crazy, man. It's crazy. All right. Well, listen, I'm gonna do my best to try to not interrupt you while you continue this narrative because we've been going for almost 2 hours now, and I do want to get to a conclusion.
I think we're about done.
Yeah.
I'm working on a proposal for a book which will include a chapter about this. Mm-hmm. I've been fascinated by the material that I've collected, and when I wrote Blue Sky, I thought, I want this to be the final word. I want somebody to be able to read this book and say, well, I don't want to get involved with that, or, I don't want to be involved with it anymore. And it's been relatively successful in that way. And it is, of course, and you too have written work that is not simply your story.
Correct.
There are 100 books about Scientology, and many of them tremendously valuable. I mean, Doctor's Report on Dianetics, the first book by Joe Winter. Helen O'Brien's Dianetics in Limbo made me cry.
I finally got a copy of that, by the way. I'm going to be reading that very soon. So, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, finding that the woman who'd run the Philadelphia doctorate course defected because her partner committed suicide because of the promises Hubbard had made to him that had completely failed. That he had post-traumatic stress disorder because he'd been bulldozing bodies into ditches after battles during the Pacific campaign. And strangely enough, he couldn't get it out of his head. And Hubbard said, "Oh, that's no problem. We'll just we'll fix that up with a little bit of creative processing, And John Neugebauer killed himself in the end because the promise failed, which was not infrequently the case. I traced quite a lot of suicides in Scientology that had come by people's expectations being raised, their hopes being raised so high. And then what they found was that they now had no money and their family weren't talking to them and that kind of stuff. But
no, just taken for a ride and then left in a ditch. That's Hubbard.
Yeah, move on to the next one, as any con artist will.
That's right.
It's the way it functions. So with Blue Sky, I wanted to write a definitive text, and several people called it that. Robert Vaughan Young, who was the senior PR for Scientology, called it definitive. Jolly West called it definitive, actually. There you go. And I wanted to do that. With Opening Our Minds, I wanted to write a book that would start a discussion. And with the book that I'm working on, which is about belief, and it comes out of a misquotation from Voltaire, which is people who believe absurdities will tend to commit atrocities. He didn't quite say that, But that thought, belief, absurd belief, atrocity, that one makes sense to me in terms of history, and means that what I would like to do is write something that can help people to examine their beliefs, that can help people to sit back and say, do I believe this because it feels right? Or do I believe this because the evidence is good for it?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't teach our kids this.
Not enough. Not enough. It's not repeated at the times when it could really make a difference. You know, you get taught in school along with 30,000 other things that are all a monotone of importance. And then you have some rough life experiences, and what do you get told? Thought-stopping cliches and feel-good mantras instead of, hey, you idiot, don't do that again. Here's how it happened. Here's how to prevent it. You don't get that. You know? Pardon me if I rant a little bit about this, but it's annoying, you know? You get thought-stopping cliches and feel-good mantras way more often than you get pointed back to critical thinking.
Yeah, slogans and mantras, and you know, while the world is, you know, headed towards climate collapse, we're not talking about climate change anymore. We are, and you're kind of going, well, you know, it's what is it Rachel Carson, the 1963, her book. Suggesting that spraying everything with DDT, Silent Spring, spraying everything with DDT was a bad idea. And we have seen so much in the 60s and the 70s, you know, when the oil industry in the 70s realized what the future was. We used to have an advertisement we used to work called Orange here. And their ad was, the future is bright, the future is orange. And I'd be thinking, is that about radioactivity, or, you know, that everything's going to be orange? I don't like the sound of that. But thankfully, the phone company's gone out of business. But the orange folk, you know, there is, you know, we are in a terrible crisis at this moment. If the Russians decide to not only stop the export of grain, which they now are doing, but attack the wheat fields, next year there's going to be a massive famine. And people are just sitting around, politicians are having conversations. We need to do something about that. And this means we have to take responsibility for our own stupidity. And foundational to that is certainties that are based upon opinion, that are based upon feelings, not upon evidence. That's right. You know, if we're going to survive, if our grandchildren are going to survive, we need to change the way we behave and the way we think, and focus on the important things, not put it off until the next election. You know, after we're elected, we'll change it, you know, but actually all of us individually take responsibility and do something about it in our own lives. That's right. And, you know, help to persuade others to do something. And that's what these podcasts are actually about. They're not about Scientology.
In case anybody needed that spoiler alert. And I think sometimes they do. So I'm glad you said that out loud, because I've been preaching the exact same thing. And and it's funny how you and I, especially more recently, have tended to go in that direction in our podcasting when we're wrapping up and kind of summating where we're going and what we're thinking is what's motivating us. It's pretty clear, right? We want people to get along better. We want the world to be getting along better. And we want it to happen through better thinking. And and the whole lesson of Scientology and Charles Manson and all this horrible behavior is there are lessons here. You know, you can watch this stuff and go tisk tisk tisk, or look at this in a sort of trauma porn, popcorn eating way. And I really hate that. I really do. I'm just going to tell you, I hate it. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people who tune into this stuff because of that. They're just interested in sort of sucking off the trauma energy or something. And I find that very strange. Mm-hmm. That's certainly not what motivates me.
Emotional vampires.
Yeah, that kind of thing, right? No, I'm not trying to, like, point the fickle finger of accusation at the camera here. I don't think everybody's doing that, but I see that in some of the comments sometimes, and you just go, God damn, I think you're kind of missing the point here. There's a way we can use this information and learn from it and do better in our own lives. And I really hope those are the messages that come across in our work, because that's the intention. And I think that's what puts us apart from, other content creators in some ways.
Yeah. And I mean, there is so much that's, junk lords or simply entertainment or some scurrilous story to tell.
Yep.
And that's fine. That's keeping people busy. But I think we are living in quite worrying times, and I'm pretty sure of that. And I believe that we have the tools to solve the problem, but it is going to mean that we have to take responsibility for our own lives, our own consumption, what we're doing, how we're behaving to other people, and that's nothing to do with religious belief or anything of that kind. I'm an agnostic. I do what I do because I understand that virtue is its own punishment. And, but if anybody watching this has ever been bad in any way or had a nasty thought, then press the button and send us $1,000.
There you go. Spiritus, Spubitus, Spaminus, and Forgiveness. That's it. Yep. I will grant you the holy forgiveness. Yeah,
and you'll go immediately to heaven.
That's right.
And just give us $2,000 when that 1,000 doesn't work, and then $4,000.
Exactly. Hold out your hand right now. If you're looking for absolution, hold out your hand. I'm gonna hit your hand with a stick of truth here, and 7 hail Xenus, and you are forgiven. That'll be $10,000, please.
3 Harry Potters.
That's right. There you go.
Grand.
All right. Exactly. As always. Thank you, Jon. Thank you very much for sharing your time and life and knowledge with us.
Thank you. It's been great, good fun.
Absolutely. And I hope everybody learned something today. I think we went into quite a few details, and I think that clincher, by the way, that business of sending people off to the UK to study Scientology, don't ignore that. That is not a small thing. And especially in the context of it, right? Where literally people were dumpster diving, and he fucking manages to figure out the money for that. What? That's pretty wild. And it says everything about his acknowledgement, at the very least. It says something about his acknowledgement of the workability or power or need for that in his life. Manson, I'm talking about here. And wanting to bring that to others in his inner circle. So what does that tell you? It tells you that it was a lot more than just a religious epiphany in prison and he moved on. It tells you this was something important to him. And if it was important to him, that means he was using it. And if he was using it, it means he was practicing Scientology. And that just matters in this picture, Yeah. And I think, like Jon said, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, building on what you said there of, and if that's a part of the picture, right? I just wanted to stress that too, it's a part. I think the drugs played a substantially larger part in terms of the programming, so to speak, of his family members, of his people. I don't know that, if you've never dropped acid, it's a powerful experience. But
if you drop it every week for 2 years, you get to it that these kids had taken acid before they met Charlie Manson. This is not the thing that he introduced to the culture. Worse, and strangely, he didn't introduce Datura, and there is no evidence that he used it himself or that he gave it to anybody. It came into the family through other members. So you also have this, let's blame Charlie for everything. Charlie Manson was a pimp. He was a car thief. he was a con man. But the Beach Boys did record one of his songs, and credited it to themselves, oh dear. But he was a bad man, but he was not this peculiar satanic monster. We didn't get into the process of the Church of the Final Judgment,
right?
Process Church of the Final Judgment, and the De Grimstons. That's the story for another time. I don't know of any evidence that they were connected to Manson, except for Scientology's own Red Box documents, where they're worried that they're going to be associated with both Manson and the De Grimstons, their Process Church of the Final Judgment. This idea of some malevolent, evil genius. Manson was just he was the leader of a group of people, but that group of people also contributed in the same way that we as Scientologists contributed to what Scientology did.
That's right.
We are not innocent, and there are mitigating circumstances because we really believed we were helping people and changing the world to be a better place. Yeah. And thankfully, we didn't murder I didn't murder anybody. You may have done.
I did not.
No, I haven't asked you.
No.
That's good. So neither of us murdered anybody. So that's good. I'd also like to say that in the making of this video, no Scientologists were harmed.
Correct. Correct. We might have used a little harsh language, but otherwise nothing bad in that direction. Yeah, it's and you can come into this with preset ideas about Manson and about how it all went down, and that's fine. I understand. Like I said at the beginning, there is an ocean of information about Charles Manson and the family and what went down there, and not all of the information in that ocean is factual. And it is up to us to figure it out and navigate and figure it out for ourselves. Fine. You know what I mean? We don't have to have big, long, huge arguments about it. I hope that this information that was presented today is something that you can incorporate into your set of facts and information and adjust accordingly. That's all I ask. Is like, think about the information, incorporate it with the rest of the information you have. And if there's contradictory information there, trace it down for yourself, figure it out. Don't just decide on a whim. Oh, Jon Atack has no idea what he's talking about. Go find out. Or O'Neill or whatever. Go read the books, go find out for yourself. Nothing wrong with that at all. We hope this information will help you do that. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. To encourage inquiry and discussion rather than to close down the debate.
Exactly.
Grand.
All right. So thanks, man. Again, thank you very much for your time and knowledge and help with all this. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
All right. And that is a promise, by the way, on the Process Church, because I did say that at the beginning, and I thought we would get into that, but no big deal, because it's another big topic. And if y'all don't know, it involves Son of Sam and satanic stuff and actual murder and all kinds of weird stuff. So that'll be another.
Well, and just to whet the appetite, the two people who founded it actually were part of Scientology in England and then moved to the US, changed their name to De Grimston, and put forward the philosophy that only those people who were extreme were of value. So they valued people who'd done a lot of good, like Jesus or St. Francis, and people who'd done a lot of harm, like Hitler and Stalin. Those were their heroes. And anybody else was called a grey, long before aliens were called greys. And they're known for having walked up and down, I think it was in Santa Monica, but in the beaches in California, all dressed in black with their what in America are called German shepherds. We call them Alsatians here. And yeah, somehow it would appear that David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam killer, had some of their literature. So that proves that we should be panicked that Satan is running America.
There it is. There it is. All part of the satanic panic of the 80s, folks. And there's a whole story there, and I can't wait to tell it to you guys. So we'll get to that. So in the meantime, thank you very much. Support our channels, like and share our stuff. Tell people about us. I mean, if you want to know what you can do to help us out, if you don't want to throw some money our way, share our work. That would be awesome. You know, there's nothing, I'm telling you, there's nothing better in terms of promotion for us than goodwill and word of mouth. So
Yeah, absolutely.
So that helps.
Spread it around.
Exactly. All right, folks. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Yeah.